Yes, Mr. Bucra.
Sir, we're turning now to Scotland and Northern Ireland, continuing our focus on the domestic production of blood products and self-sufficiency, focusing on the period up to about 1990. So before I start the substance of the presentation, a few introductory comments. This oral presentation accompanies a written note and a set of annexes. It's been disclosed to call participants and their legal representatives. It's also now been published on the inquiry website. That written note is lengthy. It covers a very large number of documents that are referenced and are available on Relativity. It's a product of a great deal of work by wider members of the inquiry team, whose names feature at the bottom. As with other oral presentations, I'll by no means be covering every document or issue even that's covered in that written note, but we will be looking at some documents in a bit more detail than is covered in the note. I should also say that while that written note is lengthy, it doesn't cover every relevant or potentially relevant document. Mr. Hill made a similar comment in relation to England and Wales. No doubt there will be more relevant documents that call participants and their representatives will flag up, as will the inquiry in due course. There are two aspects of the context in which this presentation is delivered, sir, that I wanted to highlight before we move on to the substance. The first aspect is that today follows on from evidence that the inquiry has heard, a great deal of evidence the inquiry has heard on a number of related topics. I mention that not so much for your benefit, sir, but more for the benefit of those who might be listening today but haven't necessarily attended every inquiry hearing so far. Most obviously, a related topic was last week's presentation on domestic production in England and Wales, but there's many other pieces of evidence the inquiry has heard, sir, that will have links for haemophilia centres, Professor Ludlam in Edinburgh, the presentation on the Belfast Haemophilia Centre, blood services. There was a presentation on the organisation and history of blood services in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Blood transfusion centres, we've heard from Dr. Brian McClelland in Edinburgh in the southeast of Scotland, heard from Dr. Maurice McClelland in Northern Ireland. I'm obviously not going to be repeating everything we've heard before, but it's useful to note at this stage that there are many other related pieces of the jigsaw that have already been considered by the inquiry. The second part of the context that I wanted to highlight, sir, is that this presentation is being delivered before we hear from two key figures in the history of PFC, and when I say PFC, I mean the Protein Fractionation Centre, the domestic production of blood products in Scotland, Dr. Peter Foster, and then Dr. Robert Perry. Some of the topics and issues that I cover are going to be directly related to their work. Anything I say orally or that's covered in the written note will, of course, fall to be considered alongside any of the oral evidence that you hear from those two individuals in particular. Final introductory comment, sir, is about the structure of today and tomorrow. It's broadly going to be following the structure of the written note for those who are following it. We're going to start with the origins of fractionation of plasma and creation of blood products in Scotland, and what we've described in the written note as Anglo-Scottish cooperation. We're then going to look at a transition in the arrangements for Northern Ireland, whereby Northern Ireland moved from having its blood products fractionated in England to having them fractionated in Scotland. The third area that we're going to look at is demand estimates for factor concentrates. And finally, we're going to look at Scotland's production and supply of concentrates and the question of self-sufficiency. And you will have seen, sir, that in the note that's subdivided into three sub-issues and 3 points of the timeline. Broadly, the whole sweep of this presentation today and tomorrow is going to be chronological. We're going to start mainly in the 1960s with a few brief references to the post-war period and the wartime period. We're going to end up at the end of the 1980s. But as we move through those different topics that I've just outlined, we'll be moving back and forth in time a little. So I can turn, sir, now to the first substantive area that we're going to be considering, and that is the origins of plasma fractionation in Scotland and what we've described as Anglo-Scottish cooperation. Now, when we try to discern the very early history of plasma fractionation in Scotland, we don't have any contemporaneous documents, unfortunately, but we do have a number of helpful non-contemporaneous documents which paint a picture of what was happening in the 1940s and the 1950s. So those are, two of them are highlighted in the notes, but I'll just mention them now because they're useful resources for anyone who might want to read them, but we don't need to bring them up on screen. The first is an article by Robert Girdwood, I think Professor Girdwood of the Edinburgh Centre, called 50 Years of an Organised Blood Transfusion Service in Scotland. The reference for that, for anyone who wants to read it, is PRSE 303986, but we don't need to bring it up. The second...
and he wrote that in 2008, did he?
Dr. Foster's article, which is the one I'm about to come on to, was written in 2008. I'll have to double-check, sir, the date of the Professor Girdwood's article.
Yes.
Dr. Foster's article, Plasma Fractionation in Scotland...
If it's 50 years of an organised blood transfusion service, it would have been perhaps a bit earlier.
A bit earlier.
And the organisation that he describes starts when?
He picks things up mainly in the 1940s. I think he may have some references to even earlier than that, but for our purposes, it's certainly a useful resource to understand how things were developing from the wartime period from the 1940s onwards.
Because I think the blood service as such began in 1940, 1941 in Scotland, so it'll be round about, 1990 that Girdwood would have written?
That's probably right, so I'll double-check the date and see if we can identify it for you.
Yes.
So the second of those non-contemporaneous articles is one by Dr. Foster, Plasma Fractionation in Scotland, that was published in 2008, PRSE 301732, but we don't need it up. A useful resource for trying to see some of the early features of fractionation in Scotland. I'm just going to summarise a few of those elements that come out from those non-contemporaneous records, just by way of background, really, to what we're going to go on to consider in more detail. What they suggest is that during the Second World War, a decision was taken to finance 2 facilities in the UK for the preparation of dried plasma. One of those ends up being in Scotland, and we're going to be looking at that. The other was in England. I believe that's the Lister Institute. They suggest that during the 1940s, the preparation of dried plasma took place at the Royal Infirmary, Edinburgh, the RIE. So that is where it all starts in Scotland, where fractionation of plasma starts in Scotland. The facilities were extended after the war. They were initially named the Blood Product Unit, the BPU. So in the early documents, there'll be references to the BPU, and that's the explanation for that. They were the responsibility at that time of the Blood Transfusion Service for South East Scotland. There's some references to, in the 1950s, some links between Scotland and colleagues in the United States, in particular the work of Dr. Cohn at Harvard. That seems to have led to the creation of Scotland's first fractionated plasma product in 1952, which was an immunoglobulin, and an early version of factor VIII in 1956, usually known as Cohn fraction 1 in most of the documents. BPU is extended in 1961. By the time we get to 1970, it's renamed the PFC, and as we'll go on to look at, it moves to a different site during the course of the 1970s. So that's that very early background, sir, and just a brief summary. We're going to move now into the 1960s. We're going to pick things up in the second half of the 1960s. And this is an important period because at this point, in the second half of the 1960s, when the BPU is already at a site in Edinburgh, at the RIE, plans begin to be made to extend Scotland's facility and to move it to a new location. And as part of that planning, there is a focus, as we'll see from the documents, on what might be described as a joint UK approach. So not just dividing up fractionation between England and Wales on the one hand and Scotland and perhaps Northern Ireland on the other, but looking at them together and envisaging the movement of plasma from England into Scotland. what appears to have happened is that in 1965, an agreement was reached between the relevant departments, the DHSS and the SHHD. We don't have a contemporaneous record of the agreement that was reached in 1965. We do have a useful document which sheds some light on it, which is from the later 1970s. We're going to turn to that now as our first document. It's DHSC 303715_171. Now, before I take you to particular passages, sir, I think in the written note we've described this as being from the late 1970s. We can be a bit more precise than that. The contents of the document, particularly later on, suggest that it was probably written between August 1977 and April 1978, and it is a DHSS document. The two passages I wanted to highlight are the first two paragraphs. And I'm going to read out the first, which says, in 1965, the Scottish Home and Health Department, faced with a growing demand for certain blood products, drew up plans to build a new unit in Edinburgh, what became known as PFC, which would operate on a continuous flow principle to deal with 1,500 and, if necessary, up to 3,000 litres of plasma per week. I pause there, sir, to note that we'll pick up on those numbers again. It's possible that the agreement in 1965 might actually have been for a lower figure than 1,500 and up to 3,000, but we'll pick that up in some more documents. It was then recorded that the unit would produce plasma protein solution, an albumin product, and anti-haemophilic globulin, i.e. factor concentrate, as well as gamma globulin and other fractions required for therapeutic purposes. There would also be research and development facilities at the unit. And then the second paragraph, sir, is also an interesting one. The then Ministry of Health, so I was wrong to say DHSS, it's actually the Ministry of Health, made a formal agreement with SHHD in 1965 that the PFC would fractionate plasma for the NHS using plasma collected by 4 English regions: Newcastle, Leeds, Manchester and Liverpool, then collecting 20,000 litres per annum. I take that as 20,000 litres of plasma. The original request of Scotland was that they should provide annually for the NHS about 30,000 bottles of plasma protein fraction and anti-haemophilic globulin from 10,000 bottles of blood. Now, we're going to look in a bit more detail at how that agreement developed as the 1960s went on and into the 1970s. But so that's a useful insight into the broad nature of the agreement, at least, that was reached in the mid-1960s in 1965. So I mentioned that the figure that was recorded in that document for the amount of plasma that was expected to be processed by the new unit in Scotland might be a little on the high side. I should mention there was a document submitted by Dr. Foster to the Penrose inquiry. It's recorded in our notes, in which he suggested that the agreement in 1965 was for the new Scottish unit to process 1,000 litres of plasma, rather than 1,500 going up to 3,000. He also records in that document that there were no minutes available for that agreement, which cast direct light on it, but I think we may be able to get there through the next document, which is a note of a meeting which took place on the 9th of May, 1968. And if we could go to that, please, Sully, it's SBTS 40470_105. And if we could just, that's it. We're going to spend a bit of time with this document, so it's an important one. We can see at the top right of the screen, this is a minute of a meeting which was held at the Regional Blood Transfusion Centre, the Royal Infirmary, Edinburgh, on Thursday, 9th of May, 1968. And as I mentioned earlier, at this time, Scotland's fractionation facility was still at the RIE. If we look at attendees, we'll see some names that will come up again repeatedly in a few documents that we look at. There's Dr. Cumming, who is off the Edinburgh Blood Transfusion Service, the centre. There's Mr. Watt, who I believe the previous year had been appointed director of the BPU while it was still at the RIE in Edinburgh. We can see Dr. Maycock there from Elstree, a number of other figures, including Dr. MacDonald from the Scottish Home and Health Department. And staying with the image as it is, it's useful to note that the first substantive paragraph, which has a description of what's intended for the new Scottish Centre, says the meeting commenced with a description of the continuous mixing system, CMS, for plasma protein fractionation, which was now under development in the Edinburgh Blood Products Unit pilot plant development. And there was a discussion of the system that followed. What that suggests, and this is borne out by some other documents, that while the BPU was still at the RIE, it had a pilot plant which was developing this new way of fractionating and producing blood products known as a continuous mixing system here, sometimes referred to differently in some of the later documents. Solly, if we could go over to page 3, and we're going to look at the passage which starts with the number 5. And if we could go down, that's perfect. Thank you. So we can see that the meeting moves on to consider the new facility that's planned, and we can see that it's been planned for a site in Liberton in another part of Edinburgh. I'll just highlight a few points here. So on cost, it's worth noting the first sentence there. The estimated cost, fixed equipment cost of 1.25 million, there was a suggestion there's some pressure on that estimate. It was being asked to bring it down. They were being asked to bring it down to below 1 million. If we look at subparagraph B, the date of commission, it was hoped at that point that the new facility would be commissioned in 1972. As we'll see, it was a good deal later than that. And if we could then go down the page slightly, we can see a reference to anticipated quantities to be processed at Liberton at this new site. Dr. MacDonald of the Scottish Home and Health Department said, well, he now referred to the list of quantities which had been given in 1965, so a reference back to that 1965 agreement, which showed that optimum requirements at Edinburgh were probably between 50,000 and 55,000 units of blood per million population per year. This figure is considerably higher than even the present national average, but Dr. Cumming pointed, and if we can go over the page, please, Sully. Just to a passage at the top of the page, thank you, pointed out that this would only meet the requirements for blood and blood products for the use of this region alone, and that the figures of 1965 now required revision, particularly when applied nationally. So we can already see in 1968 a sense that some of the figures which had been suggested in 1965 may need to be revised. If we could go down to the next paragraph, and I'm going to look in more detail at the passage that begins about halfway down, if the Edinburgh regional transfusion requirements. So if you could go down slightly. There you go. So it's at the top of the page at the moment. And the meeting recorded this. If the Edinburgh regional requirements and collection of fresh blood were an indication of the national trend, and if the North of England regional centres continue to rise to meet the same levels as Edinburgh, it would mean that Edinburgh, as in the fractionation centre in Edinburgh, might have to cope with 2,500 to 3,000 litres of plasma per week. And this was within the estimated maximum capacity of the plant as envisaged. If we look at the second paragraph, still on the same page here, Mr. Watts, director of the unit, considered that as there was only small possibility of expansion at Elstree, Edinburgh should be prepared to cope with the requirements of a larger part of England than originally intended, so that the total growth of requirements could be handled by the two blood products units. Dr. Maycock, director of the Elstree unit, considered this approach to long-term planning was the only correct procedure. And finally, I'll read out the final paragraph on this page. Dr. Dr. MacDonald asked if it was correct that the Liberton unit was capable of receiving 1,500 litres of plasma per week at its commissioning time, and that this could increase to a maximum of 3,000 litres of plasma per week. Mr. Watt confirmed that this was correct. A final point to note, sir, when these documents refer to plasma and how many litres of plasma it might be possible to process, they are intending to mean plasma for all purposes, so not necessarily just fresh frozen plasma for the production of factor concentrates. It might also cover plasma used for other purposes, possibly time-expired plasma for albumin products. That's an important point to bear in mind when we're looking at these different figures and moving through the years. Lastly, Sully, if we could go on to the next page, page 5. The section numbered 6, discussion on the minute of February 1965 to the SHHD. So this paragraph also tends to support the suggestion that the 1965 agreement was changed by the time of this meeting. So it says there was general agreement on this subject, and finally it was suggested that Dr. MacDonald revised this section, i.e. a section in a previous document. 1,000 litres should be changed to read 2,500 to 3,000 litres. I'd also note, sir, the passage that says that there was every possibility that the blood products unit in Edinburgh could be increased in size and output without proportionate increase in staff or accommodation. It was pointed out that the present estimate...
Now, just... That doesn't make an awful lot of sense, because could be increased in size and output without a proportionate increase. I see. Yes, it does make sense. I follow. In other words, yeah. Yes, thank you.
It was pointed out that the present estimated requirements from Liberton could be covered by a 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. 5.5-day working week, and an increase in production could be achieved by longer working hours without any increase in capital expenditure. Dr. MacDonald did not think that this would be permitted by the Technicians' Union, but Mr. Watt pointed out that the new unit would not be a hospital unit, but more like a factory. In view of the high capital investment involved, it appeared to him wrong that this building should be used only 8 hours in 24. He was fairly confident that some means of effecting a more complete utilisation of the plant could be arranged. This need not necessarily involve a 3-shift working day. Now, that final issue, sir, covered in that paragraph is one we're going to return to repeatedly as we move through the rest of the 1960s, the 1970s, even the 1980s, shift working at the new Liberton unit. The issue, in a nutshell, is the new technology that was to be applied to this facility in Liberton was intended to be able to be used continuously. What that might mean is that it can be used effectively 24 hours a day. In order for it to be used 24 hours a day, you have to have staff working in shifts. At this early stage in 1968, the possibility is raised that there might be an issue in getting staff to work in shifts. There might be an issue relating to unions and employment structure. We can see that Mr. Watt, the director, seems to be pretty confident at this time that that issue could be overcome. We'll see in later documents how that plays out. So that's all I wanted to cover in this set of minutes. So we can see some more evidence.
That had it taken place, would have been bound to have increased the number of staff, wouldn't it?
Yes. So I take your point that the question about no need to increase staff doesn't quite make sense, because if you're going to work continuously, you've got to have more staff.
And if you have 2 shifts, one after the other, a day shift and a back shift, then you've got to have double the numbers for each shift.
So that seems to be...
Same number for each shift, but double the total number.
So that seems to me to be right. It could be that there are some nuances to how a shift system might work that we can explore perhaps with Dr. Perry or some of the other witnesses. But on the face of it, as a matter of common sense, if you're going to have a shift system, so I think that seems to me to be entirely right.
Well, you're having more man hours per week. That's the whole object. And to do that, you either need people to work longer hours, which is probably untenable, or you need more staff.
So that certainly seems to me to be right.
Yes.
We can pick matters up and get a bit more detail on these early plans in a letter from a Scottish Home and Health Department official to the Treasury seeking approval in principle for this new facility. And Sully, this one is DHSC 0103 209 _172. So this is quite a long letter. I'm not going to go through all of it. If we see the date, first of all, at the top, 30th of May, 1968, this letter comes quite soon after the meeting that we've just looked at. You can see from the letter heading that it comes from the Scottish Home and Health Department. It comes from an official there. And actually, if we go down, please, Sully, just to the bottom of the page, you can see the addressee, Mr. Widdop, in Treasury Chambers, the Treasury, in other words. What this letter is asking for from the Treasury is approval in principle for the new PFC facility, or rather the new fractionation facility, because it's not yet called a PFC, to be built, and seeking approval in principle for £1 million budget. If we go, please, Sully, to page 2, and could we go right to the bottom of the page, paragraph 7. So I'm bringing this to your attention because it suggests that there was a change from between 1965 and 1968 about the technology that was intended to be used at the PFC, which is important to note. It says, when we wrote, i.e. the Scottish Home and Health Department wrote to Miss Fothergill on 29th of April 1965, we provided details of the proposed levels of production of certain blood products. These were the subject of agreements between this department and the Ministry of Health earlier in 1965. At that time, we envisaged that the new blood products unit would be operated on a batch principle, which would be a very much enlarged version of the process then in use in Edinburgh. I just pause there, sir. My understanding, in very broad terms, that the batch principle is the standard technology that was used for plasma fractionation. One batch at a time is produced. The new Scottish facility was intended to have a continuous mixing technology, and there's just a suggestion there that it had originally been envisaged to use a batch process in Scotland too. It says one of the disadvantages of this method of production is that it lacks flexibility. And if we go over the page, please, Sally, just to a passage right at the top. Thank you. And actually, could we zoom in even a bit further, probably the top half of that passage? Thank you. That reads, increased production beyond the limits of the batch size planned would be impossible without duplicating equipment and providing substantial additional accommodation. We were therefore anxious that, on the one hand, the batch size should be adequate to cope with foreseeable increases in production, and on the other hand, that it should not be excessively large. In trying to assess production levels, we were and are aware of the unpredictable variability of the factors which will determine production. The limiting factor is the amount of plasma available, which will depend on the quantities of blood obtained from voluntary donors in the various regions. It then refers to experience in Scotland, the southeast region, which has led the Home and Health Department to believe that they've not yet reached the limit of availability of blood from voluntary donors. And if we could just move down that passage. Thank you. And I'm picking things up about a third of the way down, the other factor of significance is clinical demand. Estimates of demand for plasma protein solution based on present use of plasma may prove inaccurate, since clinicians are at present inhibited to some extent from using plasma because of the risk of causing serum hepatitis. We're now inclined to the view that the estimates we made in 1965 for the production of plasma protein solution and albumin product will prove to be too low. Furthermore, we're satisfied, on the basis of our experience since then, that the estimates of anti-haemophilic globulin required are also too low. Inquiries are at present in progress, and we wouldn't wish to commit ourselves to a new estimate at this stage. So we can see there already at this early period, 1960s, some of the factors that will recur and some of the themes that will recur as we move through the 1970s and 1980s, some of the challenges that would need to be met in order to increase production. And then if we could pick up paragraph 8, where there's a description, the start of that paragraph, of a changed approach to estimating demand. Since 1965, work has been in progress in Edinburgh on the development of a continuous flow process, and a pilot plant is now in operation. This has proved successful and has advantages over the batch method, particularly in flexibility. We therefore propose that the new blood products unit should operate on the continuous flow principle and should be designed to a workload of 1,500 litres of plasma per week. But it will be capable of adaptation without substantial structural alterations to operate at levels up to 3,000 litres per week, should this become necessary. Apart from production of plasma protein solution and to haemophilic globulin, already mentioned, there's reference to some other blood products, and there's also reference to the possibility of conducting research at this new unit. So this is this official setting out and trying to explain some of the reasons why a cost estimate and a budget was being sought in the sum that it was. And if we can go down just to the bottom of the page, we can see the final figure at the bottom there, just under £1 million. And finally, the last page, please, Sally, page 4, and paragraph 11, which summarises the request in the letter. Our request, therefore, is for your approval to build a blood products unit at a cost of about £1 million at Liverton Hospital, to be followed by at a later date by a regional transfusion centre at the Royal Infirmary. There's then a request for authority for a particular sum of money to purchase some land, and a reference also to an extension to Elstree, which was then ongoing, sir. So that's a useful insight into what the plans were understood to be as of 1968. What we'll see by looking at a later document also dealing with budgets and cost estimates is that those plans are adjusted slightly as we get to the end of the 1960s. Before I get there, so I should note that the Treasury did provide approval for this request. It did so on the 25th of October 1968. That was approval in principle, subject to the provision of detailed cost proposals. One of the themes that's now going to emerge is a distinction in the way that the term capacity might be used, so production capacity. Now, it's a word that was picked up, I know, last week in the England and Wales presentation. It's a word that's used throughout the documents that we're going to be looking at into the 70s and 80s. It can sometimes require a bit of unpacking. It can be intended to mean different things at different stages. One of the distinctions I want to try and draw out at this stage is what no doubt some will say is hopelessly simplistic, but I hope might be useful, a distinction between design capacity for the buildings, so the buildings, the accommodation that are going to be built, and operational capacity, which might be made up of a number of different things. It might include equipment, staff, manufacturing processes, and what we begin to see in the next documents is what appears to be a distinction between the capacity, the building capacity, the design capacity of the new unit that's planned for Liberton, and what's proposed, even from this early stage, for its operational capacity, i.e. in practice, how much will it be able to produce? We can get a sense of that.
Well, I wonder if that's actually not in itself a simplification, because the design capacity isn't just a question of space available, or it might be, that's the way you put it over to me. It may also be a question of the system that's going to operate within that space. In other words, you're designing the system in order to produce however much. And here it had struck me that the suggestion that the design should be for 1,500 to 3,000 units, litres rather, was looking at the second of those. That's not the same as operational capacity, where you're absolutely right, it depends upon the actual equipment you put in and the way you run it.
So I think that's absolutely right, yeah, I think that.
So, but it's a good point to make. I think that we have to be careful about the word capacity and how it's being used. There was a discussion, as you may remember last week, about the precise meaning of capacity in a document.
That's absolutely right, sir, and I agree. We do have to be careful about how it's used, both how I use it myself when I'm delivering this presentation, but also when we're looking at documents and the word capacity is used. We will quite often need to look with some care in trying to discern what sort of meaning was intended.
Yes, it's not always easy.
No, but I hope we'll get there. Looking at these documents all together, we can get a sense of some of these distinctions. In the next document I wanted to bring up, it's WITN 353-0077. And this is another meeting in late 1968. If we go to the attendees at the top and the location, we can see that this time the meeting's happening at Elstree. A number of attendees who were present at the last meeting that we looked at, including Mr. Watt, Dr. Maycock, Dr. MacDonald. And if we could go down, please, to the next passages, please, Sully, on this page. And I only want to look at this first page and what Dr. MacDonald says there at the top. So Dr. MacDonald, the Home and Health Department official, first sets out some of the target dates for building and commissioning the new centre, and says it might be a bit later than had previously been thought. He then is recorded as saying this: approval in principle for an expenditure of £1 million had been given. The present estimate was, however, about 1.4 million. By designing the building to operate at 1,500 litres a week, but equipping it to operate initially at about 1,000 litres per week, it was hoped to reduce the estimate to about 1.2 million. And it was hoped to submit the cost plan estimate, which would go to the Treasury at the end of November. I'm going to come back, sir, to a later document to that distinction between the design capacity and the equipment, and how the equipment, what sort of role it played in these budgets. We've got some more detail on that. Before we get there, I should note, and this is covered in the written notes, that from late 1968, the Scottish Home and Health Department started its attempts to obtain a contribution to the capital cost of the new Scottish facility at Liberton. The sum that it eventually obtained was £400,000. We've covered in a reasonable amount of detail in the written note some of the correspondence, internal minutes that set out those attempts and set out the sums. I'm not going to go through all of them now, sir, but it's worth picking up and noting that point at this stage. That request precipitated some internal DHSS discussions But the result was that the money was eventually paid from the DHSS to the Scottish Home and Health Department as a contribution towards the capital cost of the new facility. One point that it might be worth highlighting at this stage, my understanding of how that request was framed was as follows. The Home and Health Department said to the DHSS, we need some more money to pay for this new facility at Liberton, and that facility is necessary for production of blood products on a UK basis. It had originally been planned that England and Wales would pay for blood products that it received, and that those payments would include both a capital element and an element to reflect the ongoing cost of producing the products. What the Home and Health Department said effectively was, rather than those capital contributions coming later, we'd like to have the capital cost up front, the sum which became £400,000, and that we'll start producing blood products, for you, England and Wales, and later on, the sums that you pay for individual blood products will be lower. That eventually is agreed, and the DHSS sends some money over. Before we get to some more detail about how the sums of the budget for the new Liberton site were divided up, I wanted to bring up one more document which illustrates this UK approach to the fractionation of plasma products. It's at PRSE 302199. And if we can see at the top, it's a meeting which took place on the 14th of March 1969. We look at the attendees, a number of familiar figures there from the other meetings that we've looked at. The passage I want to highlight is on page 2, please, Sully. And it's the section that begins, that's number 3, paragraph 3. Plasma supplies from Northern England to Liberton. Thank you. And we can see there a discussion about the basis for that supply. Should it be by volume or area? Dr. Maycock referred to the earlier discussions where it had been suggested that supplies should be decided on volume. It was agreed that no change was necessary. An entry that's worth highlighting here, so worth noting, Dr. Maycock indicated that Elstree hoped to deal with 2/3 of the plasma from England and Wales, and the remaining 1/3 would be processed at Liberton. So this appears to suggest a very significant proportion of England and Wales plasma was anticipated as being processed at the Liberton site. One more detail to note, so there's reference to a 46-week year. When we come to look at some of the capacity, PFC capacity documents in a bit more detail on some of the figures, it's worth noting that generally speaking, they refer to a 46-week year. And finally here, it's recorded that Dr. Maycock indicated that there could be some adjustment to the supply of plasma to the 2 units as production schedules evolved. So Dr. Maycock hoping that there might be some scope for flexibility in the amount of plasma that would be sent from England to Scotland.
Now, anyone looking at that second last paragraph would see that the design capacity, the operational capacity, or at least the design capacity of the system, to produce an estimated 69,000, rising to 130,000 units. A unit is not plainly the same necessarily as a litre. Do we know what at this stage the word unit referred to?
I'm afraid not, sir. I have tried to work out what that might be a reference to. It may be a reference to units of different sorts of blood products. It may be a reference to units of plasma protein fraction and albumin product that was produced. I wouldn't feel at all confident in suggesting that it might refer to units of concentrate. The inquiry team, we can look into that a bit further and see if we can shed any more light on what those units might represent. But at this stage, I'm not able to assist too much further on what they might represent.
As you observe those comments, we don't know what it's units of.
Quite so, yes.
So it may be units of albumin or immunoglobulin or factor concentrate of factor 8 or factor 9, and so on.
That's right.
Yes.
Unfortunately, I don't think the rest of this document helps too much in answering that question. So I now want to look at the final figures that were proposed from the Scottish Home and Health Department to the Treasury in late 1969 to shed a bit more light on the plans for the PFC as the plans finalised. So it's DHSC 0103 209 _139. So this is another long, detailed document. I'm not going to go through all of it. I'm just going to highlight a few passages. We can see the dates there, 2nd of December 1969. The recipient, again, is the Treasury, and this comes from an official in the Scottish Home and Health Department. If we can just highlight the first paragraph and just the first sentence there. In Mr. Widdop's letter of 24th of October 1968 to Mitchell, he gave approval in principle to the building of a blood products unit costing about £1 million at Liverton Hospital, Edinburgh. I'm now writing to let you know what the latest cost estimates are at the final cost limit stage, and to obtain your approval to the necessary pre-tender work being put in hand on the basis of these estimates. If we zoom out, please, Sally, we don't need to go to the breakdown of the figures, but we can see straight away that the figure has increased to just over 1.7 million. And if we zoom in on paragraph 3, just worth highlighting the final sentence of that paragraph, there's been no increase in the scope of the scheme or the scale of provision. So this is the official returning with a final cost estimate that's significantly higher than the figure for approval in principle, and trying to signal immediately that that is not because the scheme has been extended. There's an explanation in the rest of this document of why this figure is considerably higher than the previous figure of £1 million. We don't need, so I think, to go into the detail of all that. It seems to boil down to various aspects of the first estimate being underestimates and now having been revised with some more detail. If we can turn to page 2, please, Sully. There's a couple of passages I want to highlight. The first is at the top of the page, paragraph 5, furniture and equipment. If I can just read that out. Previously, we'd estimated that about £425,000 would be required for equipment. Process control equipment, which accounted for about £222,000 of this total, has now been classed as plant, and the building and plant figures now contain 286,000 odd for these items. And it's this last part that's important, sir, for the 15 fractionation stations required when the unit is operating at its full rated capacity. So that seems to suggest that 15 fractionation stations would involve the new unit operating at its maximum capacity. But we can then see, so if we go through to paragraph 4, and if we go through, please, to, once you've got to paragraph, sorry, not paragraph 4, I'm so sorry, Sally, page 4. And paragraph 10, phasing of expenditure, we can see that it was not necessarily envisaged that there would be 15 fractionation stations. And I'll read all of this out, sir, because it contains quite a lot of useful material. So from what I've said, you would have gathered that expenditure on this scheme will be spread over a fairly lengthy period. Some of it's been incurred already. We're already taking the view that expenditure over the last 2 years on equipment for the pilot plant is properly chargeable to the cost of the main scheme. Some will be required to bring the unit into operation at minimum input. Some will be incurred over a further period of years as output builds up. And then this is the important sentence. In the first instance, we intend to provide no more than 5 fractionation stations, but this will build up in due course to the full rated capacity of 15 stations. It then says, while the total final cost limit stands at just over 1.7 million, we feel that it should be possible to bring the unit into production for a total of just over 1.5 million. So what all of this seems to suggest, sir, is that as final approval was being sought from the Treasury for the budget for the new facility at Liberton, it looked like the cost could go up to about 1.7 million, which was very significantly over a previous figure of 1 million. In order to try and control some of those costs and bring them down slightly, officials are suggesting that in the first instance, the new unit won't have all of the equipment, all of the fractionation stations that it might. It would only have 5 out of 15. When we hear from Dr. Foster, and so we're looking at Dr. Foster's statement, it would be worth noting what he says about the number of fractionation units that were in place at PFC. I believe that his evidence, at least in his statement, is that in principle, it could have taken 15. There were 6 during the time that he was there. I believe Dr. Foster also says that for the initial period, the 1970s up to about 1984, only 3 out of those 6 were in operation. And when we come back to look at in more detail at capacity figures, estimates for how much Liberton could in principle produce, it may be that there's an important distinction between the maximum and 15, what it had following this budget approval, this application rather, and what it had in practice. It sounds like it had 6 stations from Dr. Foster. Just for your notes, later in December 1969, the Treasury does provide approval for this final cost limit, describes it as a novel one-off project. Building then begins in the 1970s.
Just picking up on your last comment to me.
Yes.
When it's talking about the phasing of expenditure in the last couple of sentences of that paragraph, the intention to provide no more than 5 fractionation stations will presumably save the cost of the other 10.
Yes, that's my understanding, sir.
Yes.
And that's my understanding of how the official, or one of the ways in which the official gets from this maximum figure of around 1.7 to, in the middle of that page, around 1.5. So seeking approval for a maximum of 1.7, but saying we are going to try to keep the figure lower than that, and one of the ways in which we will do so is by, initially at least, providing only 5 of these stations rather than the maximum number. So I'm going to move on to the 1970s now. So in 1971, the building of this new facility starts. It's renamed the PFC in 1970. Mr. Watt, who was the director of the BPU, becomes the director of the new centre. Building work continues until 1974, and we'll come back a bit later on to the phased approach to the new centre being commissioned and starting its production. Staying for now in the first half of the 1970s, we're going to pick matters up in 1973. At this point, it's worth perhaps noting that around 1973, the wider context in which these planning discussions are taking place begins to change. 1973 is when the first licenses for commercial factor concentrates in the UK are granted. there begins to be more of a focus on the need to undertake long-term and detailed planning for demand estimates for factor rate in particular. We looked last week during the England and Wales presentation at the work of the expert group on the treatment of haemophilia, which meets in March 1973. I'm not going to go back to the minutes of that meeting, sir, but it's an indication of the context that's beginning to change as the new PFC facility is still being built. I am going to go to a document that I think we may have looked at last week with England and Wales. Sorry, it's PRSE 304359. And it's the 20th of June 1973 meeting of a joint steering committee on blood products production, held to coordinate UK planning. Now, again, it's obvious from this document that it was still intended for production to be approached on a UK basis rather than separately between Scotland and England and Wales. We've got the attendees listed at the top. I won't take you through them again, sir, as we've already looked at this document. It may be worth just picking up the bottom of this page, paragraph 4, where it says this: Scotland had been invited to make provision in the new protein fractionation centre, Edinburgh, beyond its own requirements to process the equivalent of 1/3 the planned weekly intake of the BPL, i.e. 500 litres of time-expired plasma on a 46-week-year basis. So that seems to suggest, at least at this meeting, that it was intended that the PFC would process time-expired plasma coming from England and Wales rather than fresh frozen plasma to make factor concentrates. It says, because of the need for collaboration, and if we go over the page, please, Sully, to the top of the next page, and coordination, several informal meetings between the staffs of the two centres have already taken place. I won't read it out, but you'll see from the next paragraph that there's reference to the wider context changing, as I've just mentioned, commercial licenses being granted. Sully, could we go to the next page, 3? Thank you. It's headed Development of Facilities, and then paragraph 11, there's reference to a paper from Mr. Watt, director of the PFC, which set out the programme and timetable of commissioning for the new centre. Now, this is a document which, Mr. Watt's paper, we think we have identified it. It's not referred to in the written note. We've identified it since then. So I'll take you to it relatively briefly. It's a draft document. It's not always the easiest one to understand, but it does provide some additional insight into what Mr. Watt at least understood the capacity of the new PFC to be at this point in time and what sort of role it might play in UK production. Study that document should be at SBTS 40-284_112. Thank you. Now, if we stay, sorry, if we could have the whole page, please, just to start with. Thank you. So you can see at the bottom of this document that the author is Mr. Watt, Edinburgh, June the 12th, 1973, so that's about 8 days before the meeting that we've just been looking at. The title is Protein Fractionation Centre, a brief review. So the timing and the contents may suggest that this is the paper by Mr. Watt that's referred to during the course of that meeting, although it's not absolutely clear. Finally, it's marked as a draft on the top. I think that's probably important to note in the context of this document, because as we go through it, we'll see that it's not always the easiest to follow. It may be that it was subject to some revision. Sully, can we go to page 4, please? And then at the bottom of that page, section 2, this is Mr. Watt setting out some of the background to the plans for PFC and how much it might be able to fractionate. And he says, in this heading, in this section, which is headed Final Establishment as Briefed, the new centre, now under construction, was briefed to process up to 70,000 litres of plasma per year to include various products, including AHG concentrate. Now, what Mr. Watt meant by as briefed or was briefed is not entirely clear just from this document on its own. If we do the sums and divide 70,000 by 46, having a 46-week working year, we get to 1,500 litres a week. Now, whether Mr. Watt meant that the PFC, as briefed, with the amount of equipment it was given, was able to produce 1,500 litres a week is not entirely clear. It may be that in order to produce 1,500 litres a week, it needed more equipment than it was given at the start. If we go over to the next page, please, Sully, and the top, we can see reference to the links between Scotland and England that were planned when PFC was being designed. The intake plasma was briefed to come from the Scottish regions, 35,000 to 50,000 litres a year, and the northern regions of England, about 20,000 litres. And there's reference to other fractions, including Christmas factor concentrate, i.e. factor 9 concentrate. Mr. Watt then wrote as follows: "It was not stated but implied in the brief that plasma from Scotland would be supplied to meet all need of the community. Roughly 30% would be for AHG production. Clarification was sought but not obtained regarding the specified process requirement of plasma received from England. However, in absence of guidance, it was assumed that the fractions to be produced for England would include the full range with a possible exclusion of specific immune globulin." Now, what I understand this document to be saying here is that when the initial plans were made, it wasn't clear whether the PFC would be producing a full range of blood products for England or only particular products, maybe albumin products. But Mr. Watt seems to be saying that they went ahead on the basis that they would be covering the full range of products for England and Wales with a possible exclusion of specific immune globulin. If we could go through to page 9, and then we'll be coming up to the break, and this will be the final document we'll look at before the break, sir. The second half of the page is headed Processing Options. And we can see at the bottom of the page, there's reference to the following: an arrangement to phase purchase of main capital items of process equipment was made in 1969. This decision is now out of date and has not been reversed. The following options assume it doesn't exist. My reading of that sentence, sir, is that it refers to that decision that was taken at the end of 1969 to provide the PFC with only a more limited number of fractionation stations than it could, in principle, accommodate. There's then reference over the page to some different options for PFC's capacity. I'm not going to take you through all of them. They're not all that easy to understand. This may be a document, sir, that's worth coming back to later on. If we could look at the bottom of the page, the section Maximum Process Option, Mr. Watt wrote that the maximum fractionation capacity of PFC Liberton has increased throughout development, but it's not been possible to increase the finishing capacity in parallel. It would be possible to increase processing to around 300,000 litres plasma input, of which 100,000 litres could be as fresh frozen plasma. These increased figures would require that areas of the existing building, if we go over the page, undergo reallocation of use, and that additional construction be undertaken to provide the required increase in finishing capacity and storage. Additional quality control laboratories, staff areas, etc. would also be required. And then Mr. Watt sets out what that might be able to lead to. It includes AHG production of 32 million plasma units. And he finishes by saying this option, together with the stated capacity of BPL Elstree, would provide an adequate supply of all fractions for the UK and capacity to meet expanded need until the end of the century. Now, it's not the easiest passage to follow there, sir. I believe that what he's saying, while the PFC is still being built, so this is 1973, it's not yet finished being built, is that it could be expanded still further, and if it were, it would be possible between PFC and the facilities in England to meet requirements for patients in the UK as a whole. So I note the time. I'm going to be moving on to the mid-1970s now, in the period when the PFC had actually been built, if that would be a convenient moment to pause for a lunch break.
Yes, well, let's take a break now until 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock.